China has stopped purchasing soybeans, pork, and corn from the United States. The trade war has cost the United States its position as China's #1 soybean supplier. China also made its largest cancellation of pork orders since the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, halting a shipment of 12,000 tons of pork, according to the Department of Agriculture. Brazil has now taken that spot, as Chinese negotiators traveled to Brazil last week to hold bilateral discussions to further expand imports of Brazilian soybeans. The United States sent about half of its soybean exports to the world's second most populous country, China, last year. In 2024, China imported more than 27 million tons of soybeans from the United States, worth $12.8 billion according to the USDA. However, that relationship appears to be unraveling as trade disputes intensify. The Brazilian Soybean Producers Association has said that China signed contracts for 2.4 million tons of Brazilian soybeans earlier this month, which is an unusually large contract that corresponds to 1/3 of what China typically consumes in a month, signaling China's strategic shift away from United States agricultural imports. U.S. soybean exporters are, really expressing concern over the latest developments. In an interview, U.S. Soybean Export Council CEO Jim Sutter said, "China is a market that we don't want to lose." China primarily imports agricultural products from the United States, including soybeans, oilseeds, pork corn, and grains. Soybean imports, which are largely used for animal feed, had already suffered during President Trump's first term when the two nations engaged in an earlier trade war. Now again, Trump has imposed tariffs of up to 145% on imports from China, and China has responded with a 125% tariff on products from the United States, vowing to, fight to the end. Before I proceed, I encourage you to like the video and share your views on the topic in the comment section below. Your feedback is invaluable for us and a wider audience around the world. Soybean farmers across the United States applauded Trump's recent announcement that most of the countries impacted by U.S. tariffs would get a 90-day reprieve, providing an opportunity for negotiations. With the pause came a rate drop to 10% for each of the countries itemized during that announcement except for China. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said on Sunday he had not discussed tariffs with Chinese officials and doesn't know if President Donald Trump had talked to his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. Last week, Trump said talks on tariffs were taking place with China and that he and Xi have spoken. Beijing has denied that trade talks are occurring. The American Soybean Association, or ASA, said earlier this month that the continued escalation of tariffs with China is, pretty concerning to soybean farmers. President of the ASA, Caleb Ragland, explained, "We run the risk of immediate impacts this growing season, along with the impacts a prolonged trade war with China will inflict on our industry once again. The short-term disruptions are painful, but the long-term repercussions to our reputation, our reliability as a supplier, and the stability of those trading relationships are hard to even put into words. We're still reeling from Trade War I and are certainly not thrilled about an extended Trade War II." The United States soybean market share is also being pressured by China's effort to become more self-sufficient in grain. A report released on April 20th by the Chinese Agriculture Outlook Committee, under the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, said China is expected to increase grain production in 2025 to a record 709 million tons, up from last year's peak of 706.5 million tons, while also strengthening its capacity to supply grain and other major agricultural products. It said output is being pushed up mainly due to increased efforts to boost per-unit crop yield on a large scale. Now, what are the other export options for the U.S. soybeans and corn? Finding new buyers for the excess supply of soybeans and corn can be, pretty challenging and costly, which only makes the situation even tougher. However, Japan is actually considering stepping up its purchases of U.S. soybeans as part of a new tariff agreement. Japan's lead negotiator is scheduled to visit Washington from April 30th to May 2nd to advance discussions. The ongoing negotiations for a bilateral trade agreement between the U.S. and India could really pave the way for increased soybean exports to India. Both countries are working on a bilateral trade agreement, and the U.S. has identified soybean and maize as key agricultural commodities for potential export to India. India's demand for soybean oil is also, pretty significant, and the U.S. has actually seen increased demand from India because of droughts in South America that have impacted soybean oil exports from Argentina and Brazil. The US has imposed tariffs on a lot of trading partners, especially China. Given that China, Mexico, the European Union and Canada are major importers of US soybeans, retaliatory tariffs could definitely impact US soybean exports. If India and Japan step in as new importers, it could provide some much-needed relief to US soybean farmers. Forecasts are showing rain in the United States plains in the next week, which will be good for wheat. United States soybean and corn plantings are also believed to be making good progress. How will United States farmers be affected by the Chinese halt of United States soybeans, pork and corn? President Trump's tariffs have sent the United States agricultural industry into a, full-blown crisis as canceled orders from China are forcing farmers to lay off workers or even shut down their businesses. U.S. farm products like soybeans, pork and corn, really depend on the Chinese market and its strong purchasing power. The U.S. agricultural sector and farmers are already suffering from the tariffs. China's suspension of orders for U.S. soybeans, pork and corn has profoundly affected American farmers, leading to diminished income, heightened financial pressure, and honestly the risk of enduring harm to their enterprises. Farmers are experiencing immediate financial setbacks due to the drop in demand, and they're finding it challenging to secure alternative markets for their produce. The long-term consequences may involve harm to the United States' standing as a dependable supplier and the fragility of trade relationships. The impact of canceled Chinese orders will be felt across the industry, starting with farms forced to shutter, then slamming the longshoremen out of work from canceled sailings, and then the truck drivers who transport goods from the ports, said Peter Friedman, executive director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition. U.S. farmers across the country are already in crisis mode, from hay farmers to fruit and nut exporters, to those growing cotton and hardwood lumber, according to Friedman. U.S. soybean farmers in particular will lose out on a crucial market. China is the world's top buyer of soybeans, importing nearly $13 billion worth from the U.S. last year, according to the USDA. Friedman said other countries have been treating us unfairly for a long time. It is true. However, these are problems that have been generated over decades. They've developed gradually over decades. We cannot eliminate them with a snap of the fingers, with a sudden announcement, with a quickly imposed tariff. Does China have other alternatives to import soybeans, pork and corn? China has been actively diversifying its agricultural imports in recent years. Market data showed that between 2016 and 2024, the U.S. share of China's imports of soybeans plummeted from 40% to just 18%. Most of the products China imports from the U.S., such as soybeans, corn and grain, can be easily replaced by sourcing from other countries such as Brazil, Argentina and Australia, which are open to deepening trade ties with China. If the trade war remains in place or further escalates, the trade diversion will likely accelerate, as Chinese firms are looking for alternatives to diversify their import sources. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for new videos on important international topics.